Hi, everybody. It's Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, Stories of the Supernatural. How are you all doing? And today I have a fantastically interesting guest. His name is Kyl Cobb. And Kyl is an author of several books. Plus, he's a paranormal investigator. Plus, he also works in an area where, angels fear to tread, and a lot of paranormal investigators also fear to tread, which is cases having some type of demonic influence in them. And these are legitimate ones, by the way, because as a matter of fact, before we started recording, we were talking about how sometimes some cases are prematurely identified as having some type of demonic slant, when in truth it's not. Doesn't mean that nothing's paranormal. Sometimes there isn't, but doesn't necessarily have to be a demonic nature. Unfortunately, though, it gets used too easily. Anyway, he's an author, an adventurer, a historian, a paranormal investigator, and a demonologist. Plus, he's done so much that I told him, forget it. You're going to have to fill us in on your own bio because, it's just too many things. So here we go. Hey, how are you doing, Kyle?
I'm doing better than I deserve. How are you tonight?
Good, great. And like I mentioned, you have authored a few books, okay? You're also a paranormal investigator who's actively involved with cases, okay? And the reason why I state that is that a lot of people, sometimes, once upon a time, they do investigations, but then they haven't done that in a while. But you're actively involved in investigations. As a matter of fact, you mentioned something about right now also actively involved or receiving information about demonic cases.
Correct.
But before we get started on that, uh, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up going into this type of work.
Well, it started actually when I was very young. My dad died at 17 when I was 17 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and that put me on kind of a spiritual quest. I wanted to understand the nature of a God that would let someone suffer from cancer. And over the years, I ended up studying 22 different religions
Okay.
and going into depth on them. I kind of had a leg up, though, to be honest, because I was really fortunate when I was in junior high and high school. I had a college professor who came, went to the high school level because he was taking care of his parents.
Okay.
And so he taught us Greek education, Greek religion, Greek culture, Greek language. And so that gave me kind of a starting point above a normal kid in college.
Okay.
The My religious quest, though, like I said, it carried me to 22 different religions, and I got really lucky along the way. I was able to travel the world quite a few times. I've been to 59 countries at this point, and
Wow.
I've been lucky enough to work with both Jamin, shaman, different kinds of religious priests from lots of different religions, and experience things that kind of got me set up, ready to deal with the paranormal field. I guess one
Yeah.
of the things that it did to me is it opened up my eyes to possibilities.
Sure.
In the West, we have limitations. And one of the things I also realized very early on was that a lot of the religions from different parts of the world
Mm-hmm.
have parallels and a lot of commonalities. And if you kind of peel back layers of time,
Right.
they converge more and more. And so, as a result of that, I spent a lot of time focusing on the ancient Egyptian and actually learning Middle Kingdom hieroglyphics. And I
Wow.
was fortunate enough to get to go to Egypt multiple times, and it was a an amazing experience. And as my studies progressed, as I said, I was traveling the world, so I
Mm-hmm.
would go make it a point to go to the ancient ruins, to go read the ancient text. And even though I am not a spoken linguist, I'm a pretty good reader. I
Okay.
can learn written languages fairly easily, and as a result, I was able to actually do things like look at the Sanskrit and try to decode some of that and get meaning out of it. And
Okay.
where I couldn't do it myself, I would try to go back and get multiple generations of translation
Right.
to actually then help me read the text. And a lot of these were really obscure. One of I tell this story a lot. One of the joys of my life as a history geek, I had read about this Babylonian cleansing ritual, an exorcism. It's actually the first real exorcism ritual.
Okay.
And I heard about it in a couple, just documents and a book here and a book there. And one day I was reading an ancient Babylonian text, and I'm like, holy moly, this is the spell. This is the actual exorcism spell that every single exorcism around the world is
After
based
that,
on.
it's based on, huh? Wow.
And, for me, that was just like an amazing thing. I never intended to be to study demons and to be a demonologist in that respect, or a paranormal investigator. But what I am is I love research and I love history. And I just, over the years, developed a arsenal that when the call came, I had a young lady who was in trouble and she didn't know who to turn to. And they ended up coming to me, and I told them I'm not a paranormal investigator,
Right.
but I only experience directly with as an investigator type was I'd interacted a little bit with the guys that were in Ghost Hunters. I was in radio for a while, and I got to meet them.
Okay.
Super cool guys, and this was when they
Okay.
were just getting started.
Okay.
So when I had a request for help, that's who I reached out to.
This was Grant and Jason.
Yeah. But, they're all big stars. And for that particular group, they're like, we're booked for 2 years.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine. Sure.
And, like I said, this was right as things were getting big for them. And so they gave me the local, then I was in Atlanta. They gave me the local TAPS affiliates there.
Okay.
And I vetted them and decided that they weren't trustworthy. Maybe that's not the best word to use.
No, you know what? I hate to say it. I've spoken about it. Yeah, there are people out there, or groups or individuals in a group that, yeah, they're not trustworthy. I'm sorry.
Well,
Despite their
it's more
best intentions, but no, I agree.
well, it's more that they were charging folks to do investigations, and by definition, they were biasing that.
Sure.
They were charging businesses to find the business haunted, and then running a ghost tour on top of it.
Yeah, come on, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I-
Yeah, there's a little bit of motivation there, just a bit.
yeah. So, that got me involved when I couldn't find help for her. I put some friends together, and we did an investigation, not knowing really what we were doing.
Okay.
And it just happened to be that this particular thing had an entity that was extremely strong,
Okay.
extremely agitated, and it basically did things that at the time blew my mind. Today we're like, okay, yeah, some knocking, it slammed a few doors, it moved some stuff. I think that is commonplace now for me, but back then it was like, oh my God.
Oh,
this is
absolutely.
amazing. And so once I got into it, I was hooked, and the history research just kind of piled onto it, and I ended up on a vector where I just read everything I could get a hold of, and when someone needed help, they would call, and then word started getting out, and more calls came, and more calls came,
Right.
and put up the website, and my website suddenly has blown up around the world with people going to it to look up, because I posted not only some specific histories
Right.
for investigation sites, but I've also done things like put some of the parts of my books up there that help people
Sure.
understand demons and understand ghosts and all of that type of stuff, as well as I've made a conscious effort also to where I've been able to collect some of the older books in
Okay.
PDF form to actually put them out on the website. So it actually acts as a resource, a library, and I'll write white papers for it every few months on, I may have an investigator call that says, hey, I've got a Zozo case. What can you tell me? So what I did is I wrote a white paper on here's Ouija boards and the history of them. Here's the
Okay.
demon Zozo and how it works. And so as I do this to help other teams, I'll publish them out there for whoever needs them to then use them in the future.
And I think it's really interesting because I imagine with all your experience, it allows you to look at things not strictly from a Judeo-Christian angle, because you've traveled all over the world and you've seen different religions, like you said, that Babylonian cleansing ritual, okay, which sounds like it predated Judeo-Christian teachings, right?
Yeah, by about 1,000 years.
So, but here they were encountering, sounds like the same type of situation where, you had spiritual interference of some type because obviously they put together this ritual to address it. So, I think that's fantastic because have you like, and let me ask you something on that case that you said, and I read a little excerpt from it where you were called in and you basically helped this girl out because you just really couldn't find anybody to that you felt confident in sending over to her. Was this the first time that you actually had that first hand experience of the paranormal?
Not really. It's just the first time I'd ever been an investigator. Part of the thing is you're traveling around the world, you bump into stuff, and it
Okay.
bumps into you.
Okay.
I got really lucky in some of my Egyptian adventures. I had an incredible guide, bodyguard, driver, whatever you wanted to call him, and he would. I don't know. I should admit this on video, but he would tell me who to bribe and how much to bribe them
Hey,
to
it is what it is. So,
to get into places that were
okay.
originally completely off limits.
Okay.
And so I was able to actually do things like go into tombs that the public never goes into.
All
I was
right.
able actually to do something which you can't do now completely, which is climb the pyramids. I was able to do a lot of amazing things there. One of the first times I went into it was a smaller pyramid down in Saqqara, which is the region that has a lot of temples and pyramids, smaller
Mm-hmm.
pyramids.
Right.
Um, I was down there for maybe an hour. Coming back up, it was like a knife stuck in me.
Really?
I doubled over and almost slid all the way back down into the bottom. And
Wow.
it was the most bizarre thing. It wasn't an illness. It wasn't anything I could explain. It was the quote unquote curse, I guess. But
Okay.
it was kind of the first real transition in experience. But along the lines in Peru, I took a shortcut because my guide in Peru, my bodyguard said, "Hey, this is a shortcut," and we were out on the islands of Lake Titicaca.
Right.
This is a shortcut. It'll save you a 3-hour hike.
You're like,
And
sure.
it was climbing like a 125-foot cliff, and it wasn't 90 degrees, but it was sharp. It was probably 60 degrees
Uh-huh.
grade, and I was up about 3/4 of the way, and I fell. And
Oh,
I ended up, I only fell about 25 feet, but it
that's a
was enough
lot.
to bang me up pretty bad. And so I was bleeding a little bit out of the mouth, and I was pretty rough.
Uh-huh.
Well, the island we were at didn't have any kind of medical.
Oh,
The island we were supposed to go to, which was about an hour away, I was supposed to be staying with a shaman.
okay.
And so he carries me to this shaman, and little woman, no electricity on the island except for at that time 4 hours for one in the entire week. There was 4 hours of electricity from a generator, and that was just for the school children. And at night, the temperature went from in the 90s
Uh-huh.
to below freezing. And so here I am, really bad off, and she starts doing her chanting over it and makes a potion. And she's doing this. Her stove is this outbuilding with eucalyptus leaves burning, and so the eucalyptus is filling the air, and she's putting stuff into it, and she's going through. And unfortunately, the language she was speaking, it wasn't Spanish, and it wasn't, anything that we could translate.
Right.
But she gave me this potion, knocked me out for about 36 hours. But darned if I didn't wake up without hardly any pain in my ribs, and
Wow.
it was amazing. Since then, I've been really fortunate that I've gotten to the Maya. They're still practicing Maya today. the modern
Okay.
They still follow the same ceremonies as their ancestors. Well,
Okay.
except the blood sacrifice, but.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank God, right?
But I got fortunate. I was asked to actually to watch their sun death ritual at the
Okay.
solstice, the winter
Okay.
solstice.
Okay.
And what that meant is from the time the sun sets until morning, they have that roughly 12-hour period
Right.
to build the altar. And the
Okay.
altar is actually a summoning altar with concentric circles,
Okay.
and it's decorated with fruit and flower petals with this beautiful, elaborate design. Amazing. And what ends up happening is, once the altar is, the summoning circles are basically sealed, so to speak. The
Okay.
priest cleanses anyone who goes in with various rituals. But the
Okay.
whole idea is, at sunrise, one of the members of the tribe have volunteered to accept a demon into them, and it's a case of voluntary possession, and that's pretty frequent in a lot of different cultures. It happens all the time in Tibet and Nepal.
But let me ask
Um,
you something, and
yeah,
I'm gonna ask you, since you said, okay, what is it? Does it have to be a demon, or is there a reason, or is it why a demon?
well, the main thing with a demon versus other kinds of paranormal,
Mm-hmm.
the idea of a demonic entity is that it was never human,
Right.
and I believe that they are very old,
Sure.
and I think they're a lot like you and me, only we can't see them.
Okay.
And there's some science to that, in that as human beings we see trichromatic. We see red, blue, green, and that's
Mm-hmm.
how our eyes are set up.
Right.
But there is 1% of the population, mostly females, are tetrachromatic. They actually see infrared as part of
Wow.
their normal everyday life. So what
Wow.
that means is that when what we see is maybe just a regular, like, apple red,
Right.
they'll see it as thousands of different shades of that same red,
Wow.
to the point where we can't even fathom it. And science is only just now catching up, where they're actually there's some field study tests where they're making goggles that can simulate that, but only
Interesting.
one frequency at a time. So what happens, though, in the human mind, if I am only able to see three colors,
Mm-hmm.
something that's on one of those frequencies that I can't see,
Right.
my mind bridges that. My mind says, "Oh, I know what the background is," and it basically filters it out. I could be staring at something on one of those wavelengths,
Mm-hmm.
and it'd be completely invisible, and I would never notice it. So
Okay.
that's one of the theories behind demonics. And there's actually, in the Nepalese tradition, they actually do a lot of the demonic drawings
Right.
as a creature riding the back of the possessed. A Gruel de
Right.
Zul was one of them. There's some beautiful illustrations of it, and the idea is the demon is just like you and me. It's feeding off of whoever it's on,
Okay.
but it's kind of tagging along for the trip, kind of like a tick or a mosquito.
Right. Yes. Right. Like the
So,
person is a host,
yes,
and okay.
but not actually.
Right. No,
The,
I know what you're saying,
yeah.
and I've heard of that term used a lot, as in writing the person.
Hmm.
Okay. Um, Whether they're like a parasite, in the sense of they feed off, but they also influence the person. In other words, they can manipulate the person.
Yes.
And I guess that's when you get into what they call the different levels of, if it's not an outright possession, then you have obsession and oppression and all these different layers of. But that's really, I had never heard of that, because you always think a lot of these other cultures, they're into ancestor worship and things like that, but I didn't know that they frequently had, especially something along the solstice celebrations, where the celebration is actually allowing a demon. Let me ask you something. Is it like a temporary thing
Yeah.
that they allow the demon to take over, or what?
The deal that they work out, and this is true in most of the cultures that do it.
Okay.
Um, and if you put a Buddhist spin on it,
Mm-hmm.
the priest or the volunteer is
Right.
paying off their bad things with good karma,
Okay.
by sacrificing part of their time and their lifeblood, life energy, to the demon. They believe that it offsets it and gives them good luck. Um,
Okay.
in the case of, we were talking about the Maya, what the idea is that from the minute it goes in, and the transformation is not subtle. I mean, it is dramatic when it slides into the sky. He
Okay.
physically, I can't even come up with the right words to describe it.
In other
He changes.
words, he couldn't be faking it, is what you're
Yeah.
saying.
Well, and to give that even further, I guess, collaboration, from the time he gets it, which is right as the sun's coming up,
Uh huh.
for the next 12 hours,
Wow.
This guy is constantly dancing inside the summoning circle, never stopping, doing the most incredible types of feats that are imaginable. And this is
Okay.
12 hours solid, no water, no food, nothing.
Wow.
It's, I I worked at the Olympics in '96 when they were in Atlanta. I've
Mm-hmm.
never seen an Olympic athlete do this kind of stuff.
Okay.
It's that amazing. And then at the end of the when the sun sets, part of the ritual is involves basically the transition between the possessed
Mm-hmm.
and the being not possessed, and the shaman will actually do a cleansing ritual. It's actually a Jamin. Will do the cleansing ritual
Mm-hmm.
to push the demon back out of the circle.
Okay. So
And
in other
so,
words, ultimately they still have control. It's not where this demons say, I don't want to leave. They ultimately have control of that whole.
mostly, if you depending on your perspective of how the demons work and how that whole thing works,
Okay.
it is something that the demon does voluntarily relinquish.
Right.
But I will say, just for anyone listening who hasn't really gotten into the casework directly, demons very rarely possess people. That almost never happens. I
Mm-hmm.
use the analogy of demons are mosquitoes. They come and they take a little life force from you, and then they go to the next person and the next person and the next person and the next
Mm-hmm.
person. It's very rare that they actually will stay with the same person for long periods of time. Usually, there's some mitigating factor involved in that.
Right.
It can be maybe that the person is a severe alcoholic or severe
Right.
mental problems or things like that, which make it easy feeding. Just like, again, a mosquito, if you don't slap
Right.
the mosquito, it sticks around. And so, when we see the things on the movies and all this, all the wild possession cases,
Yeah.
those are actually very rare. And one of the things I've spent a lot of time doing is I've gone through modern possession cases,
Right.
starting from say just before the Salem witch trials,
Mm-hmm.
all the way to current times, and looked at even the Warrens cases and debunked most of them. Because
Okay.
when you actually look at the priest journals, you look at and Annalise Michael, who, if anyone saw the movie Emily Rose,
Yes.
that's the real story that Emily Rose was based on.
Right.
Um, we have the advantage in this case of the insane priest that was involved recorded most of the exorcisms, and because poor Annalise was killed in the
Right.
process,
Yeah, they went to
we have
court. They took
court
him to court.
transcripts, right? And so I was able to get the court transcripts in German and
Okay.
go through them line by line, and it recounts this entire girl's experience in a way that you would never get in most exorcism cases.
Right.
So when you look at things like that, you start to realize that most of the time that we think that we're dealing with a possession case, it's really not.
Well,
That there were a tiny, tiny minority.
you know what? And I'm gonna ask your opinion because I mean I'm sure. Yeah, you sound a lot more knowledgeable about this Annalise case, which is like very well documented and what I consider in modern times. And when you look at what happened, it almost sounds like this poor girl was really suffering more from mental illness, you
Yes.
know, than anything else. And it was just because I believe her family was deeply religious,
Hmm.
and I had read somewhere that the only time that she started talking about being possessed or was once they actually suggested that that was it. In other words,
Correct.
this wasn't from the get go. And yeah, when you look at it, you're thinking, okay, this was a bad case of untreated mental illness that was taken in the wrong direction. And unfortunately, I mean, when you look at those pictures of what that poor girl looked like by the time she died, it's like she looked so emaciated. So she also genuflected like what dozens of times in a day. It was like a
Yeah.
very a lot of compulsive behavior that. But let me ask you, in sometimes when I've had conversations with other people about demonic cases, I tell them, you know what, if you have some type of encounter with a discarnate human, and I mean we're not talking demons here, and this person was really a horrible person, sometimes what happens around that person can be pretty horrible, but that doesn't mean it's demonic. It's
Right.
just negative, but
Yeah.
that's it. Um, have you run across cases like that where people thought that they were dealing with a demonic case, and in reality, it wasn't that?
All the time. I mentioned to you before, really only about 2 out of 100 cases that I get presented pan
Mm-hmm.
out to be demonic.
Okay.
Um, Part of what you have to do is you have to figure out who the client is. You have to understand what's going on in their history as well as what's going on presently. There's a lot of mental illness. One of the biggest problems is television shows, which
Yes.
I won't use the specific name of it, but where the host gets possessed just about every week. Um, and that fuels
Uh,
the insanity. It
right. Yes.
um, If someone has a bad day, suddenly it's a demon causing it. If they
Right.
have a child that acts out because they're a teenager and normally rebellious, it's a demon causing that. I can't tell you how many times I've had clients threaten to sue me because the result was you need to get family counseling or you need to contact a social worker to consider
Right.
some of your options. And that's a risk. Anytime I take a new client,
Yes.
I'm going to tell them the truth.
Of
What I
course.
My version of it as close as I can get them, and sometimes they don't want to hear that. It's cool to be possessed. It's cool to have paranormal. It's cool to have a demon. Uh,
But Kyle, let me ask you something. In your experience, and wouldn't it be just better to have, hey, your family is going through some type of crisis, go get counseling versus having a demon involved? It's like if you pick between one and the other, it's like, okay, we'll go get some counseling, thanks. But like you said, it's like the popular thing, or,
yeah, and unfortunately, it's a vicious cycle.
yeah,
Once one of the members of the household think that they have it and mention it to the others, it becomes infectious.
yes.
And things that are just ordinary coincidence suddenly
Hmm.
become extraordinary signs of demonic. Or it could be something as simple as you have a bad electricity wire, or bad electrical wiring, and your light flickers. Well,
Right.
suddenly, even though it did that for 20 years before that point, now that there's a demon involved, it's obviously the demon trying to do something, and it's a real challenge. Part of what I have to do is I have to play counselor. I'm there at 3 a.m. in the morning when the call comes in from a woman crying because something's after her child.
It's got
Um,
to be, and you know what? Of all the circumstances that I can think of where people like start reaching for things like that is when your child is in danger, or you can't, or your kid is saying things that you're like, I don't see what that's got to be very frightening. Now I'm going to ask you because I've heard of this theory, and sometimes I tend to agree with it, but it's very difficult to verify. Do you think that when people suffer from a mental illness, it doesn't even have to be severe, that they are more of a channel to bringing in, whether, let's not even say demonic, we don't even have to go that far, negative spiritual attachments?
I'm kind of torn on it.
Mm-hmm.
I think generally speaking, most paranormal events, and that's how I usually refer to them,
Right.
is most paranormal events already are predetermined at a given location because of previous events in the past. When we're
Okay.
talking about the next level, uh, I think of kind of in my mind anyway, I have the basic paranormal events occurring, and then beyond that are um, uncontrollable ones like if you true poltergeist cases,
Right.
that's not a predetermined, but it's something that has a catalyst waiting to erupt.
Right.
Um, and again, those are very, very rare. It's not like the movies. But then when you talk about, again, demonic, I think in the case of demonics, they are attracted to
Okay.
people that, because again, I used the analogy earlier of mosquitoes feeding.
Sure. Exactly.
It does, it's not like a spotlight. It's one of those things, though, once they stumble across someone, it becomes easier to stick around a
Right.
little
And
longer.
and and
Necessary.
that's the thing. How do you verify where does a mental illness stop and the demonic start? Because let's face it, if at some point you're thinking, okay, this person might have some type of mental illness or their perception of reality is not quite there, they might be describing something which of course is real to them. And yeah, part of it could be what's going on in their brain or whatever, or psychological. but then maybe the other part totally isn't. That's why I say it's kind of hard to distinguish how much of it is made up. In other words, the way they perceive it versus what's actually happening.
Well,
And
and
go ahead.
I was going to say part of that's the reason. Like if you take the Catholic Church, for instance,
Right.
the Catholic Church has four basic criteria that they have to supposedly meet before they consider it a possession case. And there are similar things in almost every other major religion. There are basic tests. One of those is that the events occurring can't be directly linked to any kind of mental or physical ailment. Another is that the hosts themselves are displaying physical abilities far beyond what their normal abilities would be. So if I were, for instance, an Olympic gymnast, which I'm not, I'm a fat old man, but if I were an Olympic gymnast, if I were able to turn a bunch of flips, that wouldn't be anything impressive.
Right. I know
But
what
if someone who has been stuck in their wheelchair for 5 years
Yeah.
suddenly gets up and does those same flips, it becomes a more amazing factor.
Right.
So there's the physicality. Then there's the idea of knowing things that they shouldn't know. And again, there are very few historic possession cases which you can look at and say, yes, it nailed every one of them, and here's the evidence.
Right.
And the other thing is, and I'll take a quick aside, the knowing things you couldn't know. There's a case in South Africa, a little girl named Kyl, and the thing that's fascinating about this case is she was I want to say she was Swahili, but she was a culture that had they didn't speak English, they didn't speak Dutch. She was in an orphanage, and while she was there, she started showing signs of possession. Well, one of the fascinating things about this case, the priest didn't know what to do. So one of the priests was sent back to Rome for consultation.
Okay.
The priest returns, and then in, I believe it was Dutch, she proceeds to explain to him exactly where he went in Italy, who he met with, was able to actually give street names, building names. This is from an African girl who had was still living in a village.
Right.
And one of the other things that make this case so famous is during one of the exorcisms, it was an orphanage, as I mentioned. So all the girls were praying in the church during the exorcism as part of it. And there are over 100 witnesses to the little girl rising up and levitating in front of the church.
Wow.
And it's one of those things that a lot of times when you talk about things like that, there's hyperbole and exaggeration. But there are over 100 documented witnesses to this event.
Right.
And that gives it, so much more credibility than a lot of
Absolutely. I mean, how can you not? I mean, let's face it. It's like, okay, not everybody has an overactive imagination or is making it up for, or you would have people saying, no, I didn't. See, things like that, it's like, that's the part that you think, okay, and another thing that I've noticed sometimes is that when you get into some of these cases where it's a very negative overtone, like I said, whether it's demonic, whether we're talking just an attachment, whatever, when you look at when you start asking people about their history, you kind of see a trend in the family, and it makes you wonder, are there certain circumstances, usually dysfunctional ones, that also attract or are a portal for negative entities or demons to say, that's where I'm going? Have you found that at all?
I find that bad things happen to good people just as often as
Sure,
bad
of course.
people. And I think what happens, though, is good people that are comfortable in their own skin, confident people, by their nature, things that are thrown at them, they overcome quickly. So it becomes disadvantageous for a lot of the entities to stick around if they have that option.
Okay.
Or they actually just deal with it. If you've got a minor haunting going on and an object gets moved every once in a while, well, there's two ways to react to that. You can freak out and ask for someone to come in and help, or you can say, okay, I have a ghost, no big deal.
Right.
And it has been my experience, though, that if you interact, if you have a minor apparition
Mm-hmm.
kind of acting out, I think part of the reason it acts out is because it's frustrated.
Right.
Um, a lot of it seems to be that most of the apparitions that we deal with seem to have like a goldfish memory. They don't have a brain to store long-term thoughts. And so
Yes.
after about 10, 15, 20 minutes, somewhere in there, they almost forget why they, what's happened to them before that you're even interacting with them. And I think part of that is if you imagine yourself waking up in your own house, suddenly there's strangers there. You
Mm-hmm.
don't know how you got there or why you're there or who they
Right.
are. And so you start yelling at them, who are you? Why are you in my house? Well, they don't see you. They ignore you.
Right.
And I think what happens is over that time, that anger or confusion or frustration,
I would, yeah,
I think
frustration is
builds up
definitely,
past
yeah.
the memory.
Yeah.
And so what that means is that, when they're acting out and moving objects, it's because they're trying to get your attention.
Yes.
So what I found is that if you interact with them, like I used the example earlier, the good people interacting and just kind of ignoring it, that actually the activity itself fades away.
Yes.
The frustration level disappears, and then magically so does the apparition.
Yes. Yes.
So I can't say, yeah, to kind of give you the short answer to the long answer I just gave. I can't really say that the negative experience in and of itself is caused by negative people. I think it's just the way they react to the experience.
Exactly. But you said, you know what, you pointed out something really important, which is, let's say, like you said, their reaction to something happening. And let's say if you are brought up in a household where, let's say, the parents or the family members react that way, and then you grow up and it's almost, I've seen sometimes where you see a trend almost generationally where it's like, okay, like you said, nobody lives a perfect life. Bad things happen to people all the time. None of that, you deserve it or you don't. But then you see some where sometimes by the time they come to the attention, it's because they're having some type of really negative, bad, disturbances, like really out there. And then when you ask them about, they've been experiencing their family, it's like very tragic, very dark history to the family. And I think you hit it right on the head when you said it's the way they take it in and they express fear about it versus, okay, either we laugh because after a while or you just carry on your, for lack of a better word, the vibes you put out,
Right.
you know, um, as to how you handle things. And of course, those are around you. If you have children, bringing them up, same thing. None of that fatalistic, you know, expectations that life is going to screw you over, for lack of a better word. It's almost like you're inviting the bad things that sometimes are out there. And let me, even though you sound very knowledgeable, have you had any cases where something tried to either come back with you or interfere with you because they wanted to cut you off at the pass? They were either
Yeah.
mad at you or stop you.
Um, that's always a risk, and that's always something I try to remember to guard for, but I make mistakes too.
Yes.
Um, One of the things that they have the ability to do is what I have lovingly called to suggest. And I'll give you a real example of where that happened. I had a team. We were investigating a house. It allegedly had an active entity. No indication previously of any kind of demonic. It was just supposedly an agitated spirit of some kind.
Okay.
And as part of the investigations, we would usually do 45 on, take a 15-minute break, and then 45 again, change out teams, change out equipment, and as part of the investigation over the long haul. This particular point in time, we had just taken a break, and all the flashlights were working. Everybody had gone to the restroom like they were supposed to, and we went up to a corner of the house that we had not previously investigated. We were upstairs, and as soon as we walked into this one back room, there were four of us. Three of us next to me stopped. Two of them simultaneously said, "My flashlight batteries are dead. I have to go downstairs and get new batteries." And looking at them, clearly their flashlights are lit up. They just don't see them lit up anymore.
Wow.
And one of our rules is you never leave a team
Uh-huh.
by, by themselves. The third one suddenly is, I got to go pee. I can't hold it. I have to go pee, and ran off.
Oh, wow.
And leaving me standing in the dark in this room, and it's a scary experience. I'm sure that there was something suggested to me, and just my own focus, I guess, kept me from doing whatever I should have done. But I try to be very regimented. If I'm saying, okay, I'm going to be here for 45 minutes, I'm not going to leave prior to that 45 minutes.
Okay.
And those kind of things happen a lot. The more you've been exposed to it, the more you realize it, and it comes across as your thoughts. That's the strange thing.
Right. There's nothing sinister about it. It's just that.
No, it's just like you literally think, okay, my flashlight isn't working. I see all I see is darkness, or I have to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
And it's scary. I had a case. I guess wow, I want to say 5-6 years ago. It's hard to think of that far back. There was a case where allegedly it was the entity was pretending to be a little girl,
Okay.
9 years old, and this particular home, they were townhouses now, but it at one point had been an old people's home, and there was a little girl who 10 years earlier had been killed right in front of it.
Okay.
And we were able to find the police reports and all that. It was a hit and run, and the entity pretended to be the little girl. And over time, it began to demonstrate way magnitude of power off the scales. It was throwing objects. It was literally, you could say, they had those big ficus trees downstairs, and you could say, "Are you here?" And it would shake the ficus tree.
Oh, crap.
Or they had really bad, like, seashell wind chimes in the apartment, like it was a breakfast nook or whatever,
Yeah.
hanging down, and it would twist them up and let it go.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's, all of this is like off the scale for an apparition.
Yeah.
Just, you start working the math, and you're like, that took this amount of newtons to do that. This took this amount, and you're like, the energy levels are way too high. Part of what made it hard to catch or to understand what was going on is this thing, and it let us measure it. You could use a trifield meter, and you could take a trifield meter, and it had roughly human dimensions of a little girl.
Wow.
You could get it to come to different parts, and again, you could measure it, but it liked to stay in this one area of this townhouse in particular.
Right.
And the reason it did was it made all our equipment basically useless. It was the trunk where all the electricity for all the building came into.
Oh.
And so it was an EMF pump, super high. So none of the equipment, if you got within 10 feet of this, could give you any readings at all that were useful. And so it used that kind of as a shield. When we were playing with our toys, it would stay kind of on the edge of that. And so we were trying to interpret information. We couldn't get the real picture. So as things got worse on it, I came to realize for certain, everything we've done says this is a demonic entity. It's
Okay.
way off the scale. Well, about a week and a half before the girls were supposed to move away, because we talked to them and we thought that was the best course of action. And there's a lot of backstory to it, but
Okay.
they were supposed to move away, and at this point, I was completely convinced. I didn't take proper precautions.
Okay.
I screw up, and after I left the house from one of the investigation periods, I came home, and it, I guess, was ready for me.
Oh,
And
my
it
God.
suggested to me, and it told me this would have been in August in Atlanta, so 91 degrees at 10 o'clock at night. It told me I was cold, and I was freezing. I was so bad, I was trembling. I had blankets and everything else sitting outside in doing anything I could to get warm.
Okay.
This continued for almost a week.
A week?
A week. And I'm not talking about little bits of cold. I'm talking, my body temperature was still where it should be, other than having all the silly blankets on top of me. But it was a nightmare. And there are still points where you kind of think back to that instance,
Right.
and you kind of quiver a little bit because it was so bad. And the case even went further sideways after that point.
Okay.
But I can't discuss all of it. But
Okay.
suffice it to say that the two girls, they ended up getting delayed leaving the location, and one of them ended up going away for 3 months to an institution because of some of the stuff that happened.
Okay.
And the other one received counseling for months and months after that. So it
Because I was about to say, wow, thank God you told them you need to leave, instead of like, so, but, and it's makes you wonder how much of that delay was caused by whatever was there.
part of it's that, I think. Part of it is you never know who you're dealing with when you're dealing with clients, and there are all sorts of social striations
Yes.
and income levels. And
Sure.
sometimes, like in these girls' case, they were young, relatively speaking, and even moving to a different place, the financial burden is extremely difficult.
I know exactly what you mean.
They kind of trapped, and the place that they wanted to move into and had signed the agreement with, the only place they could afford, basically, at the last minute said, "Oh, these people didn't move out in time. It's going to be another 30 days
30
or whatever."
days.
And so that was just enough time for it to all fall apart.
And yeah. And I know what you mean. Within that window of time, within those 30 days, supposedly, let's say if they had to wait, a lot of things can happen.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And you know what? I'm glad you brought that up because there's another show which I think is pretty interesting, but that at the end sometimes the client gets a suggestion about, what? You need to leave, like relocate. And I'm thinking, what? That's I would say for 80% of people, that's really difficult sometimes for whatever reason, whether it's because you own your home or you're under a lease, and then of course the cost. So I'm thinking,
Yeah.
wow, this is that sometimes I don't know how viable an option that is for a lot of people. But then when you're faced with something along the lines of what you just described, it's like, what do you do?
Well, and that's again part of the risk. First of all, 99% of the people you see on TV are actors for the most part.
Yes, I know.
A lot of if I'm guessing the show that you're talking about,
Yes.
one of the things that from a historian's perspective, if you actually start vetting some of the places that the history, some of their history is a little fuzzy,
Yes.
because it's built for dramatic effect. And
Yes.
that's true with all the paranormal shows.
Yes, I know.
I can't tell you. There are places that I'm not really welcome anymore because I've taken their paranormal history and I've totally torn it apart.
And said, what?
And, you look at places like South Pittsburgh Hospital or the Waverly.
Right, yes.
You hear these stories that 60,000 people died here, and the reality at Waverly is maybe 6,000 in 50 years.
What, at Waverly?
Yeah.
You're kidding. I mean,
Yeah.
I've never done the research, but you know what happens? And I'm glad you point that out. When people claim these numbers, everybody thinks, "Oh my God, a sanatorium where people supposedly went for an incurable disease, which was TB at that time." Yeah, that makes sense. But like you said, when you actually do the research, it's like, wait a minute, that there was a lot of people that died, but not that many people.
Well, and the thing to think about when you're talking about a sanitarium too, we see the dilapidated, old, crumbling buildings.
Right.
But 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, however old the particular facility is, this was state of the art, beautifully painted.
Yes.
Nurses and doctors in their finest, uniforms and things like that. These were places of hope. People
Yes.
who were dying painful deaths, who would have no life otherwise, would go to these places and sometimes get cured, or at
Yes.
least be made to feel better. Or some of them had patient education programs. So if you were too sick to go to school, they kept teaching you. Or if you were debilitated because of the disease and the treatment, they would give you job skills that you could still do with your illness. So
Right.
these were all really super positive places,
Yeah.
and history's been perverted by the television
Well,
shows.
and you said something because a lot of times they make it sound like some of the treatments were like, oh my God, then you got treated this way. I'm thinking, yeah, because when you look at it now, but back then it wasn't meant to torture anybody. It was just that this was the best way they knew how to treat that illness,
Right.
you know. And like you said, and sometimes it did work, sometimes it didn't, depending on the person's health, age, etc. You know, but the intention wasn't like we're gonna send you over there so that they could do these experimental treatments on you and torture you. You know, yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, and that inevitably, of course, you're gonna have the drama and and everything that. But of course, it wouldn't be as scary
Well,
if you looked at it from that angle.
and part of what we find is an extraordinary amount of the television histories. If you dig back into the facility's history, it was a haunted house at one time. And you find out that a lot of their histories that they give, particularly the old hospitals, the old mental institutions,
Right.
they've at one time or another hosted a haunted house and they
Right.
created artificial fictions,
Right.
which now, 30 years later, we've forgotten that they're artificial. And they've now been incorporated into the history of the facility.
Yeah.
And I find this all the time, and it drives me completely bonkers.
You know what? I didn't know that. And because I'm always thinking of that haunted house thing as a more modern, I guess, like venture. I didn't know that, but it makes sense though. And like, if you say far, in the past and enough times, like you said, it becomes like almost like an urban myth slash truth. And if people don't
Right.
realize what it is, they just take it at face value and believe it.
Well,
And
most people can't remember what happened 5 years ago, much less, when they were children. And even the fact is when they were children and went to the haunted house and heard the stories, they didn't necessarily differentiate it between real history and not. So now as adults, they have that one lingering memory about, oh, this house is where this person got murdered brutally or whatever.
yes,
And it's often not true. And, that's where the history side of what I do always becomes a key tool.
sure.
Trying to figure out the true lay of the land when it comes to anything, whether it's demonic or a paranormal event.
Let me ask you that last case, the one that you said that you had this entity basically using or mimicking a child, and then when you did your research, you found that there had been a girl, a 10-year-old who had been killed. Do you think that it was almost ahead of the curve, trying to imitate or disguise itself as something that when whoever got there found out, it would like, yeah, of course, it's the ghost of this little girl that got killed out front. Do you think that it was that devious?
A lot of them pretend to be.
Yes.
When you
Okay.
when you go up against a real demonic, its key defense is you not believing it's there.
Okay.
You not knowing it. Again, it's the mosquito effect. If a mosquito's sucking its blood and you
Right.
don't swat at it, it's going to stay there.
Yes. Okay.
And it's as long as it stays in the shadows and it does, you don't think, it's just a little ghost, it's no problem. As
Yes.
long as it doesn't do anything to kind of play its cards,
Right.
it's safe. And so if you know that there's something there and you push it enough, sure, it's not going to tell you it's a demon. It's going to try to be an apparition. And
Okay.
that's, again, part of where you have to go and look at the situation and say, okay, what kind of physical amount of energy would it take to move an object like this?
Okay.
And part of what the laws of physics never change, right?
Right.
It always, to move any object is force times mass, basically, equals acceleration. And what that means is that apparitions, in order to move something, have to have mass.
Okay.
It may be very low, but as a law of physics, there has to be physical mass there to do it. But
Right.
if you think of them as very low mass creatures,
Right.
that means the energy level has to be extreme.
Okay.
So to something even as simple as like a cell phone, if I had low mass, the energy level to do that would be incredible. Well, if I've got a creature I mentioned earlier, like a demonic, it's physical, just like you and me, that's just invisible,
Right.
to move the phone is much easier, right?
Exactly.
If the phone is 2 pounds, it takes 2 newtons to do it, basically, because its mass is basically
Right, in
solid,
comparison, yes.
that you're only having to overcome gravity. So that's one of the key things is they'll pretend to be something weaker, something less threatening, because you'll forget about it and go away, or you'll forget about it and think it's just a little ghost. And that's one of the reasons why whenever any paranormal team contacts me and says, hey, I've got this situation, I always listen, because you never know when it's a real case for demonic and when it's not until you kind of go through the steps one by one. Okay, what's it done? What's the frequency? What's the strength level that we're dealing with? And you just have to kind of go through, kind of work through the logic to figure out what it is you're really facing. And I don't willingly dismiss any team's reports when they say XYZ happened. We have to go through it and we have to figure out what's going on.
And what you're saying is, in that case, your first tip-off was when it was able to do all these things, okay, and exert all, and basically affect all these things in the physically, that you were like, okay, this is not a little kid. There's something else here.
Yeah. Generally speaking, if an apparition's around, it's not going to move anything heavier than like a pen or, little tiny objects.
Right.
Because of the mass problem. When you go to the next level, when we talk about any kind of physical manipulation, and that's where you get into the idea of poltergeist, which is a whole other discussion. But poltergeist, because of that nature of that phenomena, can move heavy objects. And so if you start doing your checklist, does it show intelligence? Did it move a heavy object? Well, if it moved a heavy object, that eliminates the apparitions, and then it moves it into maybe the poltergeist category, maybe the demonic. Then you start looking and say, does it show intelligence? Well, poltergeists don't. Generally speaking, there's a gentleman named William Roll, who was a brilliant professor. He was at Duke, and then he went over to West Georgia University, and he's one of the few true poltergeist people to study them. And he actually is the one who came up with the idea of basically having a human catalyst for poltergeist.
Right.
That was new. Before the 60s, when Roll came up with that, no one ever correlated the fact that you usually had a little kid or a person involved in poltergeist cases. So William Roll went through, and part of his analysis was he started looking at all the historic poltergeist cases, and then other universities started leapfrogging off that. And they've gone back and looked through all the historical cases that we know of. Right. And based on that, you can start to see a breakdown of what's potentially poltergeist, what's demonic, and it becomes actually a little bit more, I don't want to use the term scientific because we're pseudoscience at best, but it becomes a little bit more clear and defined when we start looking at entities. There become tests that we can, beyond the traditional possession test, there become strength and interaction tests that we can start looking at to try to figure out what we're dealing with. And
so let me ask you something, and this, because there's always been, you think of poltergeist as being, like you said, there's usually an adolescent or a young person in the household that the phenomena kind of like centers or is always in their presence. And sometimes you think of it as just displaced kinetic energy. And then there's others, which is what I tend to believe, which is that you might have some type of supernatural agency using the kinetic energy from the adolescent to sometimes do all these things that you hear about poltergeist, like the rock throwing and like you said, sometimes stuff that's like incredibly, I've heard of appliances moving and things that, that's just, that you, like you said, it would take a lot of mass to like shift it or lift it. Or do you think that that's what it is? It's just not strictly kinetic energy, that there's a supernatural agency using?
Well, I can say, first of all, a huge preponderance of the poltergeist cases are frauds.
Okay.
Straight up, clear cut, going back through the historical record, it's routinely fraud after fraud after fraud after fraud.
Okay.
Most of what our definition of what a poltergeist is has changed over time.
Okay.
There is the Royal Society back at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, came up with basically their definition of what a poltergeist is. And they basically lumped poltergeist into any kind of agitated spirit. In the 60s and going forward, we've divided those two. Like I said, based on William Roll, and then based on a lot of other accredited universities around the world, jumping in and doing additional research in addition to Roll. And for my own personal experience, again, most of the cases are frauds.
Okay.
I can't tell you how many times I've gone to an alleged poltergeist case, and we find out that, yeah, it may be a teenager, but it's because the teenager's mad at whoever and is, doing something, and they got caught, or they, I didn't do it, my imaginary friend did it.
Yeah, exactly.
The cases that I have dealt with that turned out to be legitimate poltergeist cases, I'll mention one example. I had a young lady who contacted me herself, and she claimed that she had been able to see dead people, apparitions, all of her life. Okay. She was 12, 13 at the time, I think. It's been a few years ago. I've watched her grow up. But she said that, suddenly things have started acting out. And she was blaming the apparitions. There were some instances where plates were displaced and silverware. And it turned out, as we dug into it, that her parents were in the process of getting a divorce. Okay. And she resented her father, blamed him, and that was the target for the particular poltergeist. Okay. And so it would do things like slam doors in his face. One of the amazing things that happened, they had a fan with the lights on it. They were like tulip shaped, and the tulip shaped with a bulb in it, sitting at the table in their kitchen breakfast area, whatever you want to call it. Right. Suddenly, one by one, the light bulbs exploded and rained glass down on the dad. Okay. Then the tulips themselves exploded and rained glass. Wow. And, there were all sorts of activities and indications that the dad was the target. And he didn't believe. He was absolutely positively, there's no such thing as paranormal. He just couldn't explain these events.
I was about to say, how does he explain it?
So the young lady in question, she ended up kind of going and getting some counseling, because I talked to her and said, here's what I think it is based on the evidence that we've shown. And so she ended up going to get counseling. And within about a month and a half, no activity. It stopped. Which, for a typical poltergeist, that could be coincidental, a typical poltergeist lasts 3 to 6 months on average. And I like to say that no little girl can hold a grudge longer than 6 months. But in almost all the cases from a historical perspective that are legitimate, right, it seems like there is a solid human catalyst that has a reason.
Right. Right. Whether they even recognize it themselves sometimes. Right. Which, I'm going to ask you, now that you mentioned that, as a matter of fact, it's one of the books that you wrote about the Bell Witch.
Remember those places I'm not allowed to go anymore?
Is that one of the... Oh, you? Well, you know what?
They're not a big fan of me at the Bell Witch Tourist Trap.
I love it.
The Bell Witch is a fascinating story. Okay. And it is one that, if you go to Adams, Tennessee, right, they will swear to this day that it's all true. And that their pappy swore to it on his deathbed. Right. Even though that pappy died 100 years after the event. The story about the Bells, with the primary way we know about it, is a gentleman, Martin Van Buren Ingram, wrote a book that came out in roughly 1896. I'm bad with dates. Around 1896, 1898. He wrote a book that came out called The Bell Witch, The Truth of the Bell Witch. And he tells the book in 3 sections. The first part is his recount of the history of the Bell Witch. Right. Then he says, okay, just in case you didn't believe anything I told you, here's a double secret diary that their son wrote. Okay. In 1846, proving it. And then at the end, after the diary, he says, okay, in case you didn't believe the diary, in case you didn't believe what I told you ahead of time, here are all these eyewitness accounts that are all conveniently dead at the time he publishes his book.
Yeah, so nobody's gonna.
Of what happened. And in there, there's a bunch of these, I consider them non-canonical stories, where, like, Andrew Jackson visited the Bell Witch.
Right, yes, I've even heard that. It was like, anybody else left to come and visit the Bell Witch? It's like...
Well, and, things like that are landmines. When someone says Andrew Jackson was somewhere, Andrew Jackson, prior to being president of the United States, was a military officer.
Uh-huh.
He was a very famous military officer. He is someone that we know from the time he was relatively young in the military. His every move, every single day of his life, he absolutely, positively, empirically was never at the Bell Witch.
You mean he didn't sneak off and go to the...
No.
Go see the Bell Witch?
And, that's the other thing. Part of the story... All right, so for those who don't know, the story of the Bell Witch, a gentleman named John Bell basically leaves... He's a rather wealthy slave owner. He inherits a bunch of land. He takes his family to the middle of nowhere, the frontier of Tennessee, Adams, Tennessee. And after he's in Adams, Tennessee for a little while, some strange paranormal events start occurring. And things like strange animals that they don't recognize. Well, they just moved to a strange part of the country where they wouldn't recognize hardly anything anyway. But strange animals start appearing. Eventually, there's some rocks and things like that start thrown. That's where the poltergeist link comes into the pounding of that. But what moves this to its own strangeness category is over time the entity becomes more powerful and then actually starts to manifest.
Okay.
Where it will actually talk out loud to folks.
Right.
And drink their liquor and do all sorts of things like that, which the story gets very, very odd. The more deeper you read to it, the more time it's passed. But part of it is the idea that the entity hates John Bell. And basically what makes this case famous is this is allegedly the only case in history of an entity killing someone that it dislikes, a paranormal entity. And so allegedly the entity poisons John Bell and he dies. But as you start rolling back the history a little bit, we find out some strange things when we start to put it together. First of all, the entity calls itself Kate and claims to be Kate Batts, which is supposedly, in the mythology, she's this rich woman who has a dispute with the Bells over some land that she had that they stole from her, and there's some going back and forth. But when you actually start looking at the history, we discovered that she was related to the Bells.
Okay.
And her husband, when they went out with the Bells, actually is part of that same wagon train. And her husband, when they were building their homestead, fell and broke his back and was an invalid.
Okay.
So they became dirt poor. They owned no slaves. They basically had no property other than their little house. And so all this mythology about who she was is all wrong.
Okay.
Well, and as the story continues, you do find out, she was like an upstanding lady in the town. All the stuff that they build in the Bell Witch legend about her is completely wrong.
Right, exactly.
And you begin to discover all sorts of little holes in the story. What we do discover, though, is people would say, well, here at the Bell Witch, near the cave and the tourist trap, they're like, John Bell's buried just up this hill over here. Well, the question is, back at that time, why would a good Christian man not be buried in holy ground?
Good question.
At the church. Well, it turns out the Bells were excommunicated.
Holy crap. That says a lot. What did they do?
He was accused of usury, basically charging interest, which was prohibited by his denomination. And the deal is, what we actually discover as we dig deeper, John Bell was a slave owner who rented his slaves out as manual labor.
Okay.
On a routine basis. And this Kate Bates that we were talking about, her brother had a deal with John Bell to buy a slave.
Okay.
But John Bell wanted a lot of money for that particular slave.
Okay.
And the brother's like, well, okay, I'll buy him. But then as he got closer to that point, he's like, I don't have enough money to buy him.
Okay.
And John Bell said, no, we had a contract. You have to do this. And they argued back and forth. And what ended up, John Bell said is, well, okay, I'll let you out of the deal, but you have to pay me 30% of the value of the slave.
Wow.
Well, the church didn't like that at all.
I
And so
bet.
initially that's the cool thing about this story. We've got the church records. We've
Right.
got all of this stuff if you really dig into it. Um, the church just kind of slapped him on the wrist
He was not a
and,
nice guy.
and
Huh?
said, we don't approve. But then the court got involved. The court said, no, it's illegal to do what you've just done.
Okay.
And they actually found him guilty.
Wow.
When the court did, the church looked at it again and they said, obviously the court had more evidence than we do, and they excommunicated the Bells.
Everybody, not just him. Everybody.
So suddenly, what that means is that you have a story with a completely different dimension to it,
Sure.
and you see that it diverges 100% from the myth.
Yes.
And the more you start studying, you suddenly start realizing that it's all kind of a fabrication. And for me, I'm the curious type. I don't trust. I'm not a trusting kind of guy when it comes to any history. So one of the things I did is I developed a little software program.
Okay.
I'm a computer geek, and what I figured out a way to do is I took the text version of the diary, and in my program I basically took each one of the words
Okay.
and went out and did word history.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
And so because the diary had a clear date, it was supposed to be written in 1846.
Right. Okay.
I suddenly started having word after word after word that didn't exist in the American English lexicon
At that time.
in 1846, but they did exist in about 1890 when the Bell Witch book would have been written. So a good example is the word detective.
Uh-huh.
Detective is a noun, didn't exist in the American English at all in the 1840s.
Oh my. There.
It was
Okay.
still a verb. They were detecting something.
Right. But not as a noun.
Yeah. And so when you started looking at it, you're like, okay, this clearly proves the diary's a forgery. Then the next thing you do is you say, how are the words grouped? So instead of doing them one word at a time, let's take segments of the words and compare them to the rest of the book.
Yes.
And that's the cool thing. Don't ever buy that book on Amazon because you can get it for free on the internet. There's text versions out there in PDF because it's an old book. So you can take the text version, and I took the entire book.
Okay.
And I broke it up into phrases. And suddenly you find unique phrases that Ingram uses in his first section, and in his last section, curious phrases that are not just normal, as well as spelling mistakes and English mistakes in the diary as well.
Okay.
So clearly they seem to be written by the same author. So then the next part of rolling it back a little bit was, before the Ingram book came out, there's one other mention of the Bell Witch.
Okay.
In 1890, there's an official government document, the History of Tennessee. And the History of Tennessee basically has a section in it for Adams, Tennessee, talking about the Bell Witch.
Okay.
One of the things it says in there is how famous the Bell Witch case is. Okay? We can Google that pretty quickly. You go to a newspaper archives and you check all the newspapers in Nashville and the surrounding area, and if it was famous, there would be a mention of it because we have Nashville papers all the way back to the early 1800s.
Yeah.
Not a single mention. So then we say, okay, where did this history of this Tennessee come from? And we look, and we find out that the guy who wrote it was a newspaper editor.
Oh.
Okay, cool. Well, then we find out that he was the newspaper editor in the exact same town of 300 people that Mr. Ingram lived in, and that they knew each other.
There you go.
So then we find out yet another piece of evidence that there was a game that they played in the late 1800s called the Liars Club. It was actually an organization that would meet weekly and monthly, and the game for the Liars Club is who could tell the tallest tale and get the most people to believe it.
Are you kidding me?
You would pay,
oh my God.
You would pay a quarter or whatever at that point. You'd pay a quarter, and the one for the best for the week would get basically 5 cents of the quarter from everybody there. The one for the best of the month would get 10 cents from it. And then at the end of the year, the one who told the best for the whole year got the entire kitty that was left. And so this
Oh my
became a
God.
huge game among newspapers. And that's why sometimes the UFO nuts and things like that, well,
Uh-huh.
well, here's a newspaper from 1880 that talks about an alien abduction of cattle. Well, it's because they were part of the Liars Game. And the public knew this.
And you know what? And you make it, that's a good point, Kyle, because you know what? Sometimes people can't accept that 100 years ago there were flim flam guys back then. That people actually made up these huge stories. We always think that stuff like that is a modern thing, and not necessarily. Especially
Well,
like you said, if all the witnesses are dead, anybody who could contradict the story is dead. So there you go. There was
well,
no Google back then.
the thing is, people would actually buy the newspaper to try to find the fake stories. It became a game for the public too.
Wow.
And so what ends up happening is all of these things start contributing to the idea that sometime around 1890, Ingram suggested, hey, here's a story, because they were just mass putting stuff together from Tennessee.
Yeah.
So he gave them the story while he was already working on the Bell Witch book. And, 6 years later, it's reality.
Yeah, it took on a life of its own.
Yeah, and people believed it. And that's the thing. That's why I'm not real. They don't really welcome me too much in,
Well, you know
in
what?
Adam.
Personally, I'd always thought, is this real? Is that real? But then, when you read, you hear that all these different witnesses went to the Bell household and witnessed it, and the minister and everybody and their second cousin was there and saw stuff. So I was thinking, wait, how does this happen? And of course, this poor lady, this Kate, was made out to be like this witch who had cursed the poor farmer guy. And yeah, it's like,
Well, and two, it takes a seedier turn too. If anything really did happen,
right.
Betsy Bell was very young when this started,
Yes.
and there was her school teacher, and her had an affair. The school teacher was, I think she was 12. Again, I'm bad with dates and age numbers in general. She was around 12. The school teacher was 18 at the time,
Okay.
and they began to have a relationship. And eventually, the Bell Witch in the story takes a lot of his aggression out on the school teacher. He's not right for you, Betsy, and all that, trying to force him. Well, as soon as that school teacher leaves the story, another school teacher who lives in the same area suddenly becomes Betsy's suitor and ends up marrying her. And he's a politician. So there is some historical suggestion, anyway. If there was anything at all as a basis of the story,
Right.
it was the jealous eventual husband
Yes.
trying to get the little girl. And he, at that point in time, John Bell objected to both relationships.
I'm
He
sure.
thought that both school teachers were, not acceptable for his daughter.
Right. Here he is. He's a wealthy landowner that has slaves and everything. So I'm sure that at that time they were considered wealthy,
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm sure he was, especially for a 12-year-old, he's thinking, I'm going to get something better for her. But I guess she had ideas of her own.
Yeah.
No surprise there. But, I love it because, what, I love research. You know what they say, you go where, you follow where it goes. And in this case, that's exactly what you did. And, you're absolutely right, where nobody sometimes questions that original piece, especially if it's historical. Like, oh, of course, they would never have written something like that.
Right.
And now lied about it. It's like, yeah, they never thought that this was going to take off in the direction that it has
Right.
all these years. For example, the Bell Witch. That story has been around for such a long time. And I can see why they don't. Persona non grata is like, oh no, not him.
You have to hold your standards to the truth.
Of course.
There are places all over that I've investigated and done the history workups that now go, hey, you've totally destroyed our history. Yeah, I may have done that, but look at all the cool things I discovered along the way.
Sure.
There's a house in North Georgia, and there were some legends about things going on there.
Right.
Well, I was able to debunk some of it, and disprove it from a historical perspective. But then, lo and behold, it turns out it's built right on top of a former Cherokee village.
Wow.
And just around the corner from it is an old Mississippian mound. So it's this highly energized property that was
Mm-hmm.
part, the Cherokee suppression and all of that, and
Right.
things like that the histories don't capture. That when people like me come back in and I say, hey, I can disprove all this, but hey, here's some new stuff.
Exactly. And you know what? And I'm glad you bring that up because there's a whole set of these locations where, like you said, whether it's a hospital or sanitarium or certain houses, that they have this reputation and everybody takes it. And I'm thinking, folks, there's a lot of places out there that are a lot more ordinary and that truly have disturbing stuff going on in them, except the ones that everybody runs through, you know. Um, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a spooky looking place. You could go to an apartment,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and things can happen there, you know. It doesn't, and it doesn't have. Sometimes, yeah, like when you said, when you dig into the history of maybe the land or what was there before, you could see where the basis of what's happening is there. But everybody's always looking, like you said, the setting where there's multiple homicides or sick people dying and things like that. I mean, I agree up to a certain point, yeah, where you do have that much human tragedy. Yes, there's a very good chance that you're going to get maybe some type of supernatural, whether it's residual or intelligent or whatever. But you could go to a lot of places that are just really ordinary looking and surprise.
Right.
you know.
I find most of the time the famous places aren't really
Yes.
legit.
Yeah.
I will pimp one exception.
Okay.
There is a place in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, about an hour away from Adams, where the Bell Witch happened,
Okay.
called Red Boiling Springs.
Okay.
And the reason this place came on the radar is because ghost hunters, in their first season or first or second season,
Mm-hmm.
did an investigation there,
Okay.
and it's called the Thomas House.
Okay.
And if you do the history research on this place, nothing extraordinary, at
Okay.
least for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
It's over Mineral Springs. It was a town that during the early 1900s became kind of a super rich people's place to go for the mineral springs.
Mm-hmm.
And because it was one of the few places in America that ignored prohibition, and so a lot of activity happened there. But otherwise, the hotel itself has nothing major until the late 1980s. A cult took it over,
Oh, yeah.
and the cult kept running the hotel. And actually, I've talked to some of the people who stayed in the hotel, but they were an apocalyptic Armageddon cult.
Oh, yay.
So they believed in revelations to get on that Armageddon was coming, that they needed revelations from either demons or the dead for their members to escape.
That's a new one. Holy.
So they started doing rituals, their summoning rituals, as near as we've been able to determine,
Oh, my God.
and trying to get answers to avoid Armageddon. And they didn't really know what they were doing, because it turns out that the people who started it was really a money scam. And eventually they start fleecing rich people, promising them, again, escape from Armageddon if they donate $200,000, or for $50,000 you can talk to your deceased brother. And eventually they get shut down. Well,
Okay.
the problem was the cult never really, I guess, fully knew what they were doing.
Okay.
And what happened that when some of the current owners took over, they found the trees still had prayer scrolls in them, where they would take the prayers and write them on aluminum foil, like the Greeks and other cultures have done.
Okay.
Fold them up and put them on the trees like little scrolls.
Uh-huh.
So the owners took all those down. And coincidentally, the room that they stored them in caught on fire, burned up. But they were able to put the fire out and save the hotel, but it destroyed all the carpets in that particular area. So they had to
Okay.
pull back the carpets. And underneath the carpets, there were summoning circles with feathers and different patterns.
So they're talking
And so
necromancy, or, I mean, is this what these people
some,
were doing? I mean, the use of the dead. I mean, well, it wasn't for divination per se. It was for,
it was to actually summon the dead back to talk to them.
yeah.
And unfortunately, they didn't take any photos of the thing, so I can only go with what they told me. But I've had them sit down and try to redraw some of them and describe them. But there were basically a lot of the rooms in the hotel had this kind of stuff. And from that point forward, from the minute these folks moved in, off the chain paranormal activity.
I believe it.
We talk about paranormal doesn't exist on an assembly line basis. I've probably spent collectively about 15 or 16 nights in the hotel, and daytime too. Every single time, it's mind-blowing levels of activity.
Wow.
Mind-blowing. There's a church on the property, and the church hasn't been used in about 50 years. And as you're wandering out to the church at about 2:30 in the morning, you hear a choir. There have been instances where sitting in the church, there'll be it's an old wooden church. There'll be the sound of somebody walking up the stairwell, and then the doors will just swing open with no one there. All the time we get what I call fireflies, self-illuminating orbs, like real to the naked eye, come out of the floor and hovering, and then sometimes they'll flash and disappear, and sometimes they'll zoom around. And this is every single time.
And this only started happening after that cult had...
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Wow.
We found out for the church that one of the priests killed himself there. When there was something else that happened nasty to one of the priests there. We found out there was an EVP that they got up in the actual hotel in their large dining room. Okay. And it was a little boy. And it's heartbreaking. It is so heartbreaking because they've got bunches of them. And the little boy sometimes will say, "I'm cold." He'll say, you say, "What's your name?" "Edwin." Or a lot of times he's calling for his brother. He's saying, "Billy" or "Willie." You say, "Edwin, are you okay?" He's like, "I'm alone. I'm scared."
Wow.
You say, "What happened to you, Edwin?" And he'll say, "I drowned." Well, all this on its own, that's pretty cool. It's EVPs. But then we actually did research, and we found the obituary of Edwin, who drowned in 1961 in the hotel swimming pool while his brother Willie was the lifeguard on duty. His brother left Edwin and went up to the dining room to get sandwiches, and his brother drowned.
Oh, my God.
And, once you know that story, the real story matches up to the EVPs.
Yes.
It's just heartbreaking. And actually, I just went out I found Edwin's grave. And so, my last trip a few weeks ago out to the Thomas house, I made it a point to go to his graveside.
Okay.
And was able to get his picture off the grave, and it's just, and his brother had just died. Willie had just died all these years later.
I was going to say, now as an old man, right? Or it's an older person. Okay.
Yeah, this house is just, it's so amazing. You'll get objects rolled, like we like to, there's a ball. We use balls sometimes. It'll knock the balls around in the hall. One of the apparitions will. There's a whistle. Sometimes you'll be whistling, and it'll finish the song or keep whistling with you. And we discovered that allegedly one of the previous hotel owners loved to whistle, but we also discovered that when it was operating in violation of prohibition, that was how the guest got alcohol. You would whistle to tell the bellhop, "Okay, I needed alcohol."
So isn't that interesting?
So this house though is so amazing. Like I said, every time I've been, just over the top stuff.
And isn't it great to be able to validate what that's fantastic.
And there's still stuff that drives me nuts that I can't find out because the town has been wiped out and the courthouse has burned down 3 times.
Okay.
So there's a lot of history that's been washed away, literally. But some of the very first time I was there, 4:30 in the morning, I'm done investigating. I'm tired, dirty, all that. You actually spend the night in the hotel.
Right.
And I'm going into my room, 4:30 in the morning. I still have some cameras doing some recording in the halls and some audio running. And I hear a scream, like a woman getting murdered.
Wow.
Just as real as you can. I literally thought one of the guests had been killed.
Wow.
I run out into the hall, and literally all the other doors open up, having heard the same thing. And I actually go back and listen to the footage and watch the video, and that exact same time, you can hear just very quiet the scream actually caught on the video.
Wow.
And that location alone, people say, "Kyle, why are you going back there?" And I'm like, because it's for a paranormal investigator or even a novice, it's one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had the chance to do for just straight up paranormal stuff. It's
So,
it's where geeks like me go for vacation.
do you think it was the activity or what that cult did that basically turned up the dial on it, or do you think it has to do with the springs being there?
I think it's both. I think the springs are there acted as the energy source,
Uh huh.
and let what the cult did
Okay.
happen. Even though they weren't probably as proficient,
Yeah.
they still cobbled enough to put together summoning spells and stuff like that. So I think that acted, the springs were the catalyst, and probably is what keeps fueling it now.
Okay.
Because literally, one of the rooms in the hotel also gets those fireflies from the floor,
Yes.
and it happens to be right over what used to be the cooling room for the hotel, where the springs flow in.
Mm-hmm.
Still to this day, flow in and under.
Okay.
So I think it has a lot to do with it, but I think the cult is what turned the key
Yes,
to
I
make
can
it happen.
imagine. And what happened to the cult? I imagine what Armageddon came and went, and they just disappeared.
Well, no, they ended up on. Everybody keeps saying Dateline. I've contacted Dateline, and they don't have the archives for that.
Okay.
One of the news magazines from New York came and did a reveal. Someone reported the cult, and they did an expose, and so the cult got run out of town.
Oh,
I
okay.
actually have been able to track down the lady who was the president on paper of the cult, but she
Okay.
won't talk to us. She did, however, when when the current owners bought it,
Uh huh.
she did pay them a random visit just
Oh,
to check in. And I've also, like I said earlier, I found some people who actually stayed in the hotel,
okay.
both that it was thinking it was just a hotel, but while the cult ran it, and then people who actually were there for long term who knew about the cult.
That is so interesting. See, and that's what I'm saying. This is up there in what is it, Tennessee, right? You said,
Yeah,
which has received little or no recognition, and you've got stuff going on there that's like mind bending. And I think and absolutely like you said, between the springs and you've got this cult, and you'd be surprised at what the ignorance can still do. Sometimes, as a matter of fact, it's worse because sometimes what they conjure up is like, all right, and then they don't know what to do with it,
yeah.
even though
Well,
they were basically trying to scam people, but still.
the sheer volume of feathers suggests that there was probably blood rituals of something. Uh, because
Oh, that's not good. That
literally,
is not good.
yeah. And
Oh,
so, there's nothing demonic going on there, but there are a lot of trapped spirits, a
let me
lot
tell you
of them.
something. Whether you invoke or feed anything with blood, that's not good. There are those
Right.
people like, wow, I'd never heard of them. I've heard of the doomsday kind of like cults, where of course, the world's coming to an end, but the one where they're invoking the dead to get to figure out what to do. Wow.
Surprisingly, there's a large number of them. I actually had
Yeah.
contacted Cult Watch about this particular one,
Uh-huh.
and they didn't have a whole lot. But they were like, "Well, I've got about 10 others that match up to this." I'm like, "No, no, I'm looking for this specific one, Anzara," which, as near as we can tell, the name means something to the effect of being enlightened, or to have the light of God or the light of knowledge
Okay.
cast upon you. But yeah, the Anzara.
Wow. Yeah. You know what? I guess there's everything, but it's like it makes you ever wonder if these followers that end up there at some point, don't they start thinking, "I'm out of here." I mean, blood sacrifices, stuff like this is like, "I'm out of here," and you're hoping none of it was human sacrifice. You know. I,
Pretty sure no new humans, but you never know.
you know what? I I think there's even though Satanists are always the ones that are pegged with the human sacrifice thing. I'm pretty sure there's probably other, let's say, we don't want to call them religions, cults out there that have engaged in some type of sacrifice, including human sacrifice. Especially if, think about it, if you're thinking this is Armageddon, the end of the world, you think, okay, that's it. Gloves coming off, doesn't matter. We're all gonna die anyway. We're gonna, if you think that's truly the end of the world, if that's the thing, I don't, I could see where that could happen. And of course, if you're in this little area in the middle of nowhere with nobody to witness anything, yeah, of course it can happen. God, that's so interesting. I love that. I love that. Because what is this? Truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
And you know what? And just like that, I'm sure there's a lot of places that either one, the people that came in afterwards said, forget it, we're keeping a low profile. The last thing I want is a bunch of people tramping around here. Or some of these places, whether it's a house, nobody wants to inhabit them and they just fall into disrepair.
Mm-hmm.
Because somewhere along the line, the people that have been living there have said, that's it. I can't handle this. And they move away and they don't sell it. And they just, the structure just falls in on itself.
Or they die and their relatives don't know about the story.
Oh, yeah.
And then sell it to, some yuppies that want to renovate it not knowing that it was, axe murder took place there or whatever. So.
Yeah, right. Gentrification. Or, yeah, let's demolish it and let's build this nice new. God, I was speaking to this other gentleman and he was telling me about this place in Kentucky where at one point it was like a woman's hospital. Basically, whether you were mentally ill, women that were indigent, destitute, unwed mothers, everybody got lumped into there.
Right.
So of course a lot of human tragedy, suicides. It ends up in modern days it's become an apartment building. I don't know if I don't think they renovated. I don't know if they tore it down, right? But bottom line, in the place of this, they have an apartment building, and of course the people living there are having all these experiences, and it's like, yeah, of course, and including one of them saying that he had witnessed the apparition of a woman hanging herself, and then it turned out that when they started doing a little bit of research, that's when they find out all this history on of what was there before. And I think that's so. Anyway, Kyl, tell me about the books that you are working on, or what's the next one that's going to be published?
Well, I'm going to do, my last book was called Ghost and Demons, Disturbed Destinations.
Yes.
And that was kind of a travel guide of 26 locations, mostly in the South, with their histories, including the Thomas House that I mentioned earlier.
Oh, okay.
And so I've been asked, there's a company that does paranormal tourism called Ghost Hunt Weekends.
Okay.
And I've spoken for that group quite a few times.
Okay.
On different topics. And so they've asked me to produce a special edition of that book that actually has new material in it on the other sites that they do investigation on. And so that's probably the next one that's coming out, and I think that may be out. My part's written, and I think it's going to be out sometime in the next month or two, give or take.
Okay.
But the next big books that are in the pipeline, I have a book on I almost said poltergeist, on possessions throughout history, starting with just prior to the Salem witch trial, and actually going through cases since then, all the way up to tackling the Warrens and debunking a lot of their famous cases.
Yes.
One of the big ones in there is there's the Devil Made Me Do It murders.
Oh, yes, the one in Connecticut?
Yes.
Oh.
I've actually been in touch with the possessed.
With Arn Johnson, yes. He's still alive, isn't he?
Well,
Arnie or Arn? No, I'm sorry, the boy?
The boy, yeah. Glatzel,
I'm sorry.
David Glatzel.
Yeah.
And so in Cheyenne, who did the murder. And basically there's a whole lot of evidence totally disproving everything the Warrens have said. And there's actually, David sued the Warrens and the book publisher to keep it from being reprinted. Because he was a minor when the first edition came out. Right. And his parents they only received $2,000 in compensation for using all this stuff. Well, when the book went to be reprinted, he was now a legal person. He was now legal age, and so he sued to prevent it. They ended up settling out of court. But
Okay.
before that happened, there are all sorts of depositions, and they even have a website that's frozen in time, going
Okay.
through and detailing all the facts, refuting everything the Warrens said.
Right.
Ironically, recently it's become in the news again a little bit because Mr. Brittle, who wrote the Warrens books for
Right.
them, is their, you can't call him a ghostwriter because he's actually the credited writer
Okay.
of all the famous Warren cases. He had signed an exclusivity contract with the Warrens,
Okay.
and that said that he received any kind of derivative rights on
Mm-hmm.
any of those cases. They were supposed to share them.
Right.
But all this Conjuring movies came out.
Mm-hmm.
The movie studio didn't pay him a dime. They claimed that it was all historic. It was all true stories based on historic events. So he's just now sued the Warrens as well as the movie company for stealing his work. And
Wow.
basically, he's in his filings, he's asserting everything the Warrens did was completely made up. They would sit around a table,
Oh
and they
my
would
God.
lines and all of that. So suddenly we've got all this evidence saying they're complete frauds. And the irony is now
He's like taking no prisoners, huh?
no,
Okay.
and the irony is the movie studio, in
Uh-huh.
order to win the court case,
Right.
has to be able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt in court that paranormal events are real.
Wow.
And
Oh.
so, we've spent 2,000 years and we can barely, get,
Yes, exactly.
and suddenly they're
Duplicate
having
it.
to do hundreds of millions of dollars in a lawsuit based on this event. And that's why some of the new material, like with the new Annabelle movie, it's allegedly taken a completely different fictional direction
Right.
from many of Warren's books. It's because of this very problem. And so,
Right,
and
yeah,
any,
well, because I mean, they even changed it because I believe the original Annabelle was a Raggedy
yeah,
Ann thing, and they kind of changed it to that made up, scary looking.
well, it's the same reason they didn't get rights to the owners of Raggedy Ann refused.
Yeah, can you imagine? Let's
Yeah.
give a bad reputation to our doll. Hello.
So the new book is going to take a look at cases like that.
Oh
Um,
wow.
and that one tentatively is going to be called Forgotten Lore. And then parallel to that, just because I'm an insane researcher,
Mm-hmm.
there's the Arcane Armory book. And it's a strange name, but what that is I'm a science geek.
Okay.
And my first paranormal book, Lost Things, I go through and I talk about all the physics and science behind a lot of the paranormal.
Okay.
But one of the things is TV shows constantly are parading out all these new gadgets.
Yes.
And they don't tell you the whys. They just say, oh, this is going to detect ghosts now.
Right.
Well, I go through and I look at the real science
Uh-huh.
and things like the spirit box.
Yes.
Complete crap. The Frank box, the spirit box.
Right.
Even Frank used to say, well, I don't really think it's talking to dead folks.
Right.
And you'd say, well, how does it work? And say, well, I don't know. Well, it's simple science, right? If you understand how radio signals work, if it's AM signals are weak, so they bounce off the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can get AM signals from all across the planet, depending on
Okay.
what he did is he broke the radio so its tuner basically would continually rotate. The frequency modulator would
Okay.
rotate. And he took out the filters. So that's
Okay.
why it's more staticky and makes a lot of strange sounds that you can interpret falsely as speech. Well, then the modern ones have gone a step further, and they said, we'll do it for FM. And FM's a little different. The FM signal is much stronger than the AM. But what they've done is the FM signal, they've layered it. It's like a layer cake.
Okay.
And the way radio works is there's a main signal, and then you piggyback the other signals on it, kind of get pushed along the way. And what happens is this layer cake isn't just the commercial radio like you hear, your rock station or your talk news or whatever.
Okay.
In addition to that, there are things like radio station backdoor feeds where the engineers are talking to each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Even secondary signals where they're broadcasting from point to point, like for a live broadcast, it's going to be delayed. So there's all these signals in this layer cake.
Okay.
Well, what's happened is, including some commercial wireless like stuff, like some walkie-talkie type stuff and all that.
Right.
Well, what they've done is they've broken it. They took out the frequency modulator.
Okay.
They took out the filters. And now you're getting stuff all throughout the layer cake.
So it could be anything. It could be anybody talking on there.
Yeah.
Could.
And when they say, well, you'd never hear someone cursing on a commercial FM. True, but if you listen to an engineer talking in the background,
Yeah.
yeah, And, they say, well, it's the same voice over again. Yeah, because he's talking back and forth to whoever he's working with,
Right.
doing whatever his project is, or her project, or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And, then we start with devices like that. People only remember the positives. It's like when you go to a psychic. The psychic may tell you 99 things that are wrong, but you'll remember those 2 or 3 things that were right. You'll say, darned if she didn't know everything about me.
Yes. That's the way it works.
If you're predisposed to think you're going to hear voices from a spirit box, you're going to hear voices.
And you're going to interpret them to be like, yeah, and it, yeah, right, exactly.
So I go through and I look at all the different kinds of tools like that and tear them apart. From a science perspective, I've got laying around here somewhere, as I reach over to the side, practical electronics. So, you get into them and you tear them apart and say, well, what's the science? Where's the theory?
Well, you know what? And to me personally, I think it's what's the use of getting proof if it's not real?
Right.
I mean, if that's what you really want, that is, if you're looking for sensationalism, yeah, of course, then the more sensational the equipment or the method, great. But, if that's not what you're looking for, it's like, I want the real proof. And if this equipment, like you said, forget it, discount it, because, yeah, more than likely, that's not communicating with any dead person. It's like you said, but the thing is, most people don't know that, Kyle. Most people don't understand the working of electronics or things of that nature.
Well, and that's where this new book comes in. That's where my first book came in. When I wrote the first paranormal book, I wrote Lost Things. I'd been working on history books. I have a whole series of history books on my little podunk small town, and I spent 6 years writing those history books.
Wow.
So right in the middle of taking kind of a mental break on those, I was like, as a paranormal investigator, what don't I know the answers to? So I sat down and I started writing what I didn't know the answers to and researching it.
Okay.
And because I figured if I don't know it, the average paranormal investigator doesn't know it.
Sure.
And what I discovered, is so much of it is smoke and mirrors. So much of, we take for granted, one of the key tools they use in paranormal investigation are the EMF detectors, the K2.
Yes.
But when you really dig into it, what's the theory? And you discover that, well, the idea of electric and paranormal goes back to when electricity was still cool.
Right.
And it was a novelty and it was magic.
Yes.
And so it dates back to the spiritualism era. Well, once electricity became kind of nothing special, then we by that point we developed the Marconis, the radios. That became something special.
Right.
And magical. So suddenly that was it. Then as we entered the nuclear era, radiation became the cool thing. And so suddenly Geiger counters were used for paranormal investigation, which makes absolutely no sense, but that's a whole different science reason. But Geiger counters were used. And, we keep going through these shifts in technology. The whole idea behind the K2, if you look into it, the K2 meter, which is the one for folks to know with the little green lights and all that, it was designed for commercial work. But it was such a bad tool, it was so inaccurate, that the company was bankrupt. They were filing bankruptcy.
Wow.
The guys from St. Augustine Paranormal sent a K2 to ghost hunters. They used it on a show, and suddenly, boom, it's the industry standard for ghost hunting.
Right.
And every other EMF detector, with one noticeable exception, is based on the K2 technology. The one exception is there is a company that produces the tri-field meter.
Right.
That's actually a science tool. And they actually have an electronic grade and one that's natural. That's the only one that's actually developed specifically to really use in science that's accurate. And one of the interesting things about that is, if you look at, I mentioned William Roll earlier, one of the things they did was they studied the correlation between electric phenomena and paranormal.
Yes.
And most of the time that came up 50-50. All the different studies, sometimes yes, sometimes no. But one of the other studies suggests that it's the magnetic, not the electric component.
Right.
And so the cool thing about the tri-field is you can do only magnetics.
Okay.
And you have to know how to use it, though, because it's again, it's a little science grade tool, and it's not all digital. But
that's the thing. You're right. That it's gonna give
you
spoon feed you the information.
Right.
Oh yeah. I totally agree with, and see, and that's one of, don't get me wrong, I understand the intent behind it, which is to basically analyze it or capture it or duplicate it or prove it, really is. But like you said, sometimes it's like, what are you trying to use to prove this? It's like that doesn't work, you know,
Well, and
because
you
you get
start,
a high EMF spike, not, a lot of people equate that to paranormal, occurrences, and that doesn't necessarily go jive all the time.
well, and especially in today's society where electromagnetic signals bounce all over the place all the time,
Mm-hmm.
cell phones, relay towers, all of
Yes.
this constantly bouncing it back. What we do find kind of fascinating, though, if we, from a science perspective, when we're looking at the tri-field, if I'm on magnetic, I can actually tell if a human walks into the next room.
Okay. Interesting.
So, because the human body basically has enough of an electromagnetic field
Field.
to
Yes.
trigger it. So, that element, it could give credence to the idea of detecting paranormal, but not for the electric side, which most people think, but for the
Mm-hmm.
magnetic. And that's
Yes.
something that it's a nuance that there hasn't been a lot of work done on, but I think maybe that's where it's going. But the idea behind my books is to try to get people educated, to
And
try
you
to.
know what? And I know that it's very subjective, but and I'm sure you've experienced it, that sometimes your own body is the best indicator
Yeah,
of when something is going on, especially if you're trying to basically check off all the possible regular things and you realize this is not normal. This is, there's something that maybe my senses can't actually capture, but I feel it, somewhere part of our brain is understanding that there's, you know, uh, whether it's interdimensional or I don't know what, but you feel it. There's a shift, there's a change, and you
well,
can't,
I
but how
think
do you
as a
prove
species
that?
we've spent well as a species we've spent 300,000 years evolving, and our whole evolution is to preserve ourselves. And I think
Yes.
our minds are capable of processing our senses on a level beyond our regular understanding. It's just like a lot of times when someone says they're an empath.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you start looking at it, it's maybe that they're reading the person physically. Their eyes are scanning them better than most people's. They're
Yes.
collecting more data than most people. They're hearing different ranges. They're seeing different parts of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of things like that have biological explanations.
Yes.
And so when our body reacts to the presence of paranormal, it may be the very same thing. It's, maybe we're picking up the changes in the magnetic field. Maybe we're picking up changes in temperature that are
Yes.
just subtle that we can't ourselves consciously perceive them, but that our
Yes.
subconscious reacts to.
I'm gonna ask you because I want to know, or if you can, that story that you wrote about that case, that first case you had back
Yeah.
in '06, and then you said that the f- the girl moved away, but then a year later,
Yeah.
the red-eyed stranger came back. Whatever happened with that? I
Um,
have to know.
so for the people who are just who
Yes, if
haven't
you could.
read it yet, it was a story I mentioned earlier where the young girl she called her, actually her friends initially called and said there's something after her child,
Okay.
and I tried to refer it out to because then I wasn't a paranormal investigator.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I tried to refer it out. Everybody was con men or not available, so we did it ourselves. And not knowing what we were doing, that first case had a lot of activity. We had an audio recorder because I'd bugged the whole house. I'd spent a ton of money in the first investigation.
Okay.
I had audio recorders bugging the whole house, and there's one point where one of my friends who I'd conned into doing this is changing out a battery, and we get a Class A EVP saying, watch this in the middle of his conversation.
Wow.
Exactly at the same time, because I had bought a security system. I had cameras rolling. At the exact same time, well, about 5 seconds later,
Uh
one
huh.
of the video cameras starts to pick up a blob in front of it.
Wow.
And it's a color camera, so it's shooting with regular light. And the blob, you hear the camera's motor spinning as it's trying to focus, and the blob comes up to the camera and starts to shake the camera. And for that's a cool experience.
Yeah.
We got. I mentioned the fireflies earlier. The first time I ever saw a self-illuminated orb, we're sitting in the dark in this house, and a blue light comes out of the wall, hovers there for half a second, makes a 90-degree turn, and goes through another wall. One of the reports from the client, the night before we investigated, because we're supposed to investigate a week later, but the night before we ended up investigating, she came home at 1:30 in the morning, and she got out of her car, and she was meeting her boyfriend there, and his car was there.
Oh my God, that is such a good story. Tell that.
She
Yes.
saw someone pull back the blinds, and thought it was the boyfriend. As she walks toward the house, the boyfriend gets out of his car.
Oh.
They think that it's a burglar. They go searching the house, nothing. Then they're all hyped up and they're watching television, and I think partaking of some illegal substances. But then
Trying to relax, you mean? Okay.
Yeah. In the middle of that, the breaker box is about 20 feet behind where the couch is, 20 feet into the right. The breakers start turning off one by one.
Wow.
And the boyfriend gets up and goes toward the breakers, and then they start turning back on. And allegedly 3 times this happens, and by the 3rd time, the boyfriend's almost at the breakers. And as the lights start going out, all the doors in the house slam.
Okay.
And so they just are terrified. They run out. They're so scared they leave their dog, and they won't go back in the house to get the dog.
Poor dog.
So I get this crying phone call. So the next morning we go and investigate. So these things that I mentioned happened, and we think that we've done a really good job for our first investigation. And so we lock up the house, and the girl's not there. They have not been back to the house since they ran out.
Okay.
So we're out front, still chit-chatting. It's at that point, it's probably about 3:30 in the morning. And as we're sitting chit-chatting, 2 of my investigators just suddenly get the, oh my God look on their face.
Wow.
As the blinds in the girls' room get pulled back.
Oh.
So all Scooby-Doo style, we go.
Oh my God. Oh, that's what I call exactly that. I call it the Scooby-Doo moment where you're like.
Yeah. So we get there, and we're sitting there trying to figure out what's going on, and what could have possibly accounted for those blinds moving. And our backs are we've closed every door in the house as part of our lockdown at the end of the night.
Okay.
So our backs are to the two other bedrooms.
Okay.
It's like a T intersection. And as we're standing in her bedroom door trying to figure it out, something starts pounding on the middle bedroom door, the one that we had the watch this earlier. 2 of my investigators run out, and I'm not gonna to embarrass them by saying I'm pretty sure I smelled urine, but I'm not gonna say that.
That's surprising.
But we ended up, we opened the door, nothing there. So we're still all excited, but it's late, so we leave. Well, as I'm literally pulling out, the little girl calls. I say little girl, she's 21, 22. She calls and says, "Is it safe for me to come get some clothes?"
Oh.
And I'm like, "Well, yeah. Nothing hurt us. We had some experiences, but nothing hurt us." And well, she goes. So we ended up missing each other. I go home, and I get this phone call on the way home from her, and she's just bawling and crying, and she's like, "There's something banging on my baby's door." And so she left the house. She never went back. They abandoned all their clothes, their furniture, everything.
Wow.
So that was the quote-unquote end. Well, it wasn't. One of the things that had been reported with this house is she had a little boy who was 3 at the time of the first investigation, and he kept seeing a man with red eyes.
Okay.
And that was one of the main things happening. She had actually, at one point, gotten in her car and looked in the rearview mirror, and he was staring back at her.
Oh my
her
God.
sister had lived in the house for about a 3 or 4 month period while she was pregnant, and they would hear voices all the time at night. And her sister would say, "Don't bother me, bother the other girl." And it would stop bothering that sister and go bother the primary client. And a
Wow.
couple instances, the girl had been sleeping in her bed by herself and felt someone roll over next to her. So
Yeah.
there were a lot of things that led up to this. So the man with red eyes had come because they had gone to a party, self-proclaimed witch playing with a Ouija board.
Right. And I was going to ask you, do you think the source was when she played with a Ouija board, or and then it just hung, just attached itself to her, or was it something that was already at that location where she was living?
It was something they picked up there because it wasn't locked to the house. It was locked to the child.
Oh.
It had decided that the child was its going to be its, and it became the child's imaginary friend. And when it and the child would play, there would be things like the kitchen cabinets, which again, this is by that time, the time of the investigation, the kid was 3. Upper kitchen cabinets would be opened. There's no way the child could get to them, and so it was playing with the child regularly. And
Wow.
so when she moved, things got quiet for a while, and then I get a call. Kyle, I need help. Activity started back at our new place.
Wow.
And by that time, I was a little more seasoned in dealing with the stuff. And so we went in and we did, though I'm not as, probably was not as qualified as I am then or am now, but we were able to do some cleansings and do some stuff to make it more difficult for it. And it stopped finally. But it was an easy task.
Was it demonic?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
It was specifically trying to attach itself to the child, to feed off the child permanently.
So wow. So all that stuff they left behind, it wouldn't matter anyway.
Yeah, and I felt so bad about it, but it was one of those things that
Can
when it first happened, we weren't prepared for what we ended up facing.
well, think about it. You also didn't realize. I mean, yeah, you could say, well, my lack of experience, but from what you're telling me, when you went into that, you weren't thinking it was going to be demonic or anything. You were thinking, I'm hoping I catch some type of evidence based on what this girl is telling me. You know. Wow. But then that thing that you said where she's feeling something next to her in the bed. So it wasn't just strictly the kid, it was like also messing with her
Yeah.
big time.
Yeah, definitely. The fact that she saw it in her rearview mirror.
That is like,
Yeah.
what? That's, yeah. Well, that was a while back, so you never heard from her again?
No. I've stayed in touch with her.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Um,
Okay.
She's living a happy, normal life. Her
Good.
child is much older now, and there hasn't been any activity since that second round.
I'm telling you. What a great story. That's why I had to ask you. I said, okay, this guy with the red eyes pops again. I need to find out after they left everything behind. And yeah, I kind of suspected that. I said, you know what? If even after they moved, this thing's resurfaced, chances are that had nothing to do with the location. It had to do with them or one of them.
Right.
Okay, Kyle, thank you so much for all the time that you've spent. I've
My pleasure.
included a link to your website on the credits of the show. Also, as far as your books and everything are concerned, you have such great stories. And you know what? Believe me, any paranormal investigator worth their salt appreciates doing exactly what you're doing as far as verifying the facts, especially if it's just not taking it at, even old historical documents sometimes, like you proved, can be falsified.
Yes.
Not falsified in the sense, but they're not accurate. And a lot of people base it when they say, oh, well, this newspaper that came out in the turn of the century, they wouldn't lie. Yeah, especially if they had this thing going on. I think that was great. What a great story. But yeah, that's a big eye-opener also to, yeah, you really need to look at the, like you said, if it's available, historical records in not only the newspapers, but documentations such as birth certificates or other sources, because sometimes there's a big difference as to what's really there. Wow.
Yeah,
Yep. Thank you so, so much, Kyle. It has been wonderful, at least as far as I'm concerned.
it's been a
And
pleasure.
likewise, and I will be following up with you to see when your new book comes out because you know what? I'm guilty. I'm the one that sometimes when I go on vacation, I'm always looking like, okay, well, if I'm going to stay somewhere, why don't I find some place that's got a reputation for being haunted or, has got some type of phenomena attached to it? So I could see, I would love that book. So absolutely. Thank you so much, and have a fantastic rest of the week, okay?
My pleasure. You too.
Bye bye.
Goodbye.
Oh my God. Okay. I say this about all my guests. I think they're all wonderful, and they're all wonderful in their own rights. But, um, you know what? I think it's great again to speak to a paranormal investigator that's very well qualified with firsthand experiences. You know what? That story about the bell, which I loved it. I loved it because that is one of those cases I've always heard about for years, and I just never had a chance. And you're always thinking, well, there's got to be maybe some truth to this. Maybe it was in poltergeist. Well, what is this? That supposedly all these witnesses went and testified that it was accurate, and this is what the truth is. And you know what? I bet that that's happened in a lot of cases that people look at the historical, and the historical is not quite accurate, to put it nicely. So, and again, for all those people that are caught up, and I say this again, in all these well-known haunted places that everybody goes to, I'm not going to say they're not all haunted because there are some that yes they do have paranormal, but I would say 80% of them aren't really. And if maybe at some point there aren't, those entities were crossed over, maybe usually by some very well versed psychic or spiritualist, which is the right thing to do, by the way. But anyway, but the flip side of that is what I was telling Kyle. There are a lot of places, just like that Thomas house that he spoke about, which are not nationally known. They haven't have had all the paranormal shows going in there and doing their version of an investigation, which have got a lot of significant stuff happening. Okay, uh, sometimes they're the scene of tragedy, sometimes they're not. Sometimes, and this is one of my things happen that were never documented in a newspaper. And the truth is that when bad things happen or bad things are done to somebody, guess what? They're not documented. People get buried, and and or done away with, especially back then. Nobody's none the wiser, which sometimes there's a good source of uh, what they call intelligent hauntings. And come to find out later on, maybe, through some oral tradition or through contacting a historian, you'll find out, oh, yeah, this happened. Or like what he said, that, they discovered that there was a Cherokee village and Cherokee mounds, and it's not coincidental that a lot of places of worship, regardless of what the religion or the culture was, are usually placed around certain locations because of what's going on there. It's not happenstance that it's where it's at. As a matter of fact, they have found a lot of churches, even in Europe, were built on the ruins of old temples. And sometimes it was apparent there wasn't, not that there was anything there, but there's a reason why they're there. But anyway, which means you could go to a lot of places and you could run into a full-fledged haunting. And I hope you took note of what he said about what he's found when he comes across demonic cases, which he also made a very good case, that out and out possession thing. That's very rare. And I've said this before. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen, but it's not as common as people tend to think, especially lately, that it happens all the time. Um, so anyway, guys, I hope you liked this show. I know I loved it. Yay. That's right up my alley. I hope you're catching me on Facebook and on Twitter. I'm live streaming there. I'm also starting to live stream here on YouTube when I'm out in the field. I've been going to a lot of places. I've had a lot of requests to go up to northern Florida, which I'm planning to do. I've also had a lot of requests to do some things down in my area down here. Um, a lot of I've come up. I'm not going to go into it because I'm still in the research phase of it. But again, it's a lot of disturbing things that you come across that just people forget. And unless you really know what you're looking for, you realize and you go, wow, this happened here? Yep. And then when you get other people saying, hey, you know what, I've seen or I've heard or blah, 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 you're like, you start putting two together. So I'm going to be going out into the field down here in my area. But anyway, guys, today it is Monday for me. I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of the week. I hope you enjoyed this. And again, thank you so, so much for watching. Take care.